Good evening, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed your day off. I know if you're anything like my kid, the kids, they're hoping that there's a snow day tomorrow. I keep telling them that the snow's probably coming at the wrong time for us to be able to have a snow day, but if you are one of those hopeful people, keep on hoping. If we do end up at school together, we'll be taking our Chapter 26 and 27 tests tomorrow. And so we'll be able to knock out any questions you guys have tonight. Feel free to stop by and see me also if you have any questions before your test. Or feel free to email me. I've got off periods 1 and 2 for second semester, which leaves me a lot of time to be able to answer your questions when you guys are getting yourselves ready. So let's get started with your review session. The first question that's on the board tonight is asking about two different things with the West. Number one is about the ghost dance. And the ghost dance is a ceremony that Native Americans out in the Dakotas, the Lakota or the Sioux, were practicing after the Battle of Little Bighorn, trying to bring back the ancestral the strengths that they had before the settlement of white people into the Dakotas. And that was something that caused a lot of nervousness for the settlers that were nearby. So we see a correlation between the ghost dance and then the massacre at Wounded Knee that happens in 1890, which is largely seen as the last of the military conflicts that are going on with the Native Americans out west. It's a one-sided affair where the Native Americans are going to get attacked and killed by the United States military. Men, women, and children will all find themselves being killed in that attack. In correlation with that, what you see going on with the Native Americans is an element that many people in the United States are prizing as what's known as the safety valve philosophy, which is that you don't have a buildup of radical ideas and political movements that have any sort of force behind them, because when those individuals are becoming radical, they have the option of moving out west to the frontier where they can find space. They were mentioning inside your textbook that that's kind of overstated, where most of the people who move out west are middle to upper income people who have the means to be able to move out to farmland or other sorts of opportunities out west. So it's kind of a mythology that the safety valve was I can't contribute to the idea of anarchist or socialist or communist, but it is seen as an element that could be seen in play, and then also that a lot of people were valuing as part of what made America what it was. Your next question, asking about who was Ignatius Donnelly and why was he important. When it comes to AP US history, not very important when it comes to the big picture. He is somebody in the state of Minnesota who is involved in those farm movements that you see developing with the Grange as they transition into the Alliance system. So inside state history, he's a name that is familiar to many Minnesota state historians, but he isn't going to be a big thing to know on the AP test. A question is here about the third-party system and the fourth-party system. So let's break apart each of those different systems, because all they're trying to highlight for you is that we traditionally go towards two-party systems because of the Electoral College. In order to get elected president, you need to get a majority of the votes, which means having 3 or 4 or 5 major parties makes it really problematic to get elected without throwing the election in the House of Representatives. And so for you guys, what you want to be noticing is your first party system is Federalists versus Democratic Republicans around the time of George Washington. You then saw that shift into the second party system when we passed the era of good feelings, and you then had the Democrats versus the Whigs during the era of Jacksonian democracy. Your third political party system is going to be Republicans and Democrats leading into the Civil War with their sectionalism, and then moving through the Gilded Age, where you see the Republicans and Democrats become very close to each other with the spoils system. The fourth party system is going to be when the populists are going to pull some of the Democratic Party towards a more liberal position on the political spectrum, and many Republicans also be directed as their so we're going to find that we're going to see a new party system breaking out between the Republicans and the Democrats, taking on the question of like the role of government, especially in economics, dealing with the after effects of the Panic of 1893. So that's what we're moving into as we move into our fourth party system. The The next question I see here is asking about the big sister policy and the insular cases. So the big sister policy is just the idea that the United States has that they are supposed to be taking care of the Latin American countries that are threatened by the Europeans. I saw a number of questions that were on the board asking about what's going on with Europe during this time period. And so keep in mind, this is a period of imperialism where the Spanish had control over lots of Latin America, and then they've been losing control over that, as you saw with the Spanish-American War. When there's a vacuum created there, a lot of these countries are now independent, but they have been very much weakened by the fact that the Spanish have been taking resources out of their countries and using them for monetary purposes. So when you look at like a Cuba, a Puerto Rico, a Haiti, Mexico, and other places, many of them are going to struggle to defend themselves, and they're going to find themselves deeply in debt because they had a very imbalanced relationship with the dominant colonizing country that was using them imperialistically. So what's going to be happening is a lot of European countries, especially Britain, are going to be trying to figure out ways to see if they can take over new territories as a version of their imperialism. This is what's going to lead us to the Roosevelt Core. Roosevelt says not only should Europe stay out of the Americas, but also there's a tactic that the British are using to take over these countries. They're giving them a lot of money to put them into debt, kind of like you saw going on with the Native Americans or with sharecroppers. And then when they end up in debt, those European countries will then use this as an excuse to come in and dominate that country because they've been unable to pay their debts. And so they can have a legal basis for why they take over. Teddy Roosevelt's Roosevelt Corollary, part of the big sister policy and the big stick diplomacy, is going to be with the idea that if there is a Latin American country that gets into economic problems, America is going to come in and be the middle person between the European country that is owed money and the Latin American country that owes money. This isn't meant to save that country, though. If anybody's going to take over that country, it's not going to be the Europeans, it's going to be the United States. And so we're going to use this as a way to get entry into a lot of countries in Latin America as part of our imperialism in the early 1900s. And so we're going to see that there's a dominance that's taking place. And so when the big sister policy is described in your textbook, they will describe it as being a bad neighbor policy, because for many Latin American countries, they don't see America as the greatest friend. They see it as a threat. The insular cases has to do with the after effects of the Spanish-American War. When you look at imperialism, the easiest part of any sort of war is the military aspect of the war. The after effects then is where things get complicated. So after the Spanish-American War, America is going to win in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. And with a country that is very much having racial issues and not a feeling of equality going on between the white citizens and the people of color inside the country, you're going to find that there's then a huge issue about what do we do with a Puerto Rico once they become an American territory? What do we do with the Philippines? And the insular cases comes from the fact that many of these people in these countries are going to argue that since they've been conquered by the United States, the Constitution should then cover them with basic protections like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and all these other independences. And what the Supreme Court is going to rule in the insular cases is until the United States determines what type of territory the newly conquered areas are, they are not fully protected by the Constitution. So we're going to find that places like Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines are going to have very different relationships with the United States based on what their conquering status is going to be. With Cuba, notice two different agreements. So first of all, notice the Teller Amendment before the Spanish-American War. This shows you the idealistic United States, where they're going to go into the war saying that their only goal is to set Cuba free so that they could be like our American revolutionaries. After the war is done, they're going to create the Platt Amendment when they realize that Cuban independence means that Cuba might do things that might not square with what the United States foreign policy is going to be, especially in the Caribbean. And so you're going to have the United States create the Platt Amendment saying that, yes, Cuba is independent as long as America is okay with the decisions that the Cubans are making. And so you're going to find that this limited independence very much makes them a dependent of the United States, especially when we carve off areas like Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and make it into a military base where they're independent, but they've got a military base on their land that is American property that can be used to flex American muscles from that point forward. Puerto Rico will eventually become a territory of the United States with the right to apply for statehood, but it's got a number of strings attached to that as well. So it is part of the United States, but it is also going to be seen as something apart from the United States. Guam becomes a military base. The Philippines are not going to be incorporated. Instead, they're going to be their own territory, but they're going to be governed by the United States. And so the United States is going to treat them as a protectorate where we are controlling their country, but they are not citizens of the United States. They're just holding on to them until they can establish themselves as an independent group. And America is very cautious about saying when that date is going to take place. So the insular cases in big picture is just describing with the Supreme Court that until the United States government defines what that new territory is, its citizens are in a weird sort of place where they are not technically citizens and not protected by the Constitution. Your next question that I see right here is what was the open door note and why was it important? Your big thing to understand is when we get to this point in history, Japan and China have been battling against each other, and China has been losing quite a bit, especially since Europeans have been trying to trade with China for centuries, and now they've been able to do so since China has not kept up industrially. They've got an imbalance of trade going on, and then there's an opium war initiated by the British, where many Chinese people become hopelessly addicted to this drug, and that's going to weaken their society and their resistance. So eventually, European countries will take over all the port cities in China. By taking over all the port cities, they can then trade in that specific area and freeze out other European countries from trading in that port. When America is finally able to get across the ocean and trade regularly with China, they're going to find all the ports in China filled, but they're also going to find themselves in possession of one of the strongest navies on the face of the planet. And so they're going to practice some gunboat diplomacy where they're going to send over something called the open door note, which is going to create the open door policy. And what it's going to do is it's going to say, sure, these Europeans have all these different ports scattered across the coast of China, but America is going to have a special relationship with China, and as a result, we're going to be able to trade with every single one of those ports, even if they're controlled by Britain or Germany or other sorts of countries. None of the countries are going to agree to this, and America is just going to push their way in with their navy, trusting their navy is strong enough to be able to force other countries to respect them. So that's going to be the reason why the open door policy is going to fly. It's going to create some tensions over in over in Asia. But a lot of the Europeans are distracted by the fact that there's tensions rising over in Europe that are preoccupying them. And then also Japan has designs on taking over chunks of China. And so when America moves in like that, it's going to get Japan's attention. And we're going to see that over the next few decades, the tension between those two countries is going to be rising as well. We already covered the Platt Amendment. Why was Cuba granted freedom but the Philippines weren't? A couple different reasons. Like we mentioned, first of all, their freedom and independence is going to be limited with the Platt Amendment that is going to put restrictions on how free they can be. But then also the proximity of Cuba to the United States, it's very close. So if they decide to get too independent, they're very close to the United States and they can do something about it. And then we create a military base in Guantanamo Bay, which really limits the amount of rebelliousness that the Cubans can have towards the United States. For the Philippines, though, this is a crucial place for Alfred Mahan's ideas. For our Navy to get to China, we need to have some sort of base, and the Philippines serves that really nicely. Also, the Philippines, if they're allowed to be independent, there's a solid chance that a number of countries, either in Asia or in Europe, are going to look to dominate that place. Because they're very much not able to defend themselves from the United States or the Spanish, and so the Americans are nervous to turn them loose. Plus, also the Americans are looking to use these people not just militaristically to create military bases, but also economically to trade with them. So for the Philippines, they're going to find themselves in a distinctive place. There's also a feeling that we're kind of close to the Cubans because of their revolution, but there's some racial issues that are going on between the Philippines and the United States where a lot of Americans see them as being too different compared to the Cubans. And so they're making distinctions racially over who can be seen as sufficiently close to America and who cannot be seen that way. We've already discussed the Roosevelt corollary, so I'm assuming you're good with the idea that it extends the Monroe Doctrine and allows America to be the middleman whenever there's an economic dispute between Latin America and the Europeans. So it kind of gives America a foot in the door to start expanding into the Caribbean. The next question I see here has to do with the Dawes Severalty Act. Dawes Severalty Act is really simple. So remember we talked about in the mid-1800s, there's reservations that are being built inside of states. And there's a feeling that the Native Americans, by owning this reservation collectively, they're not assimilating into the United States style of living, and they're also holding on to more land than many Americans feel like they deserve. And so what they're going to do is they're going to take this reservation and break it up into homesteads and give individual homesteads to individual Native American families to try to force them to become farmers. Remember, if they're west of the 100th meridian, though, they're not going to get enough water to actually make a go of that farm, and that farm's going to struggle. Remember, also, whatever land is not taken up by divided up by the Dawes Severalty Act is going to be given back to the United States government to sell to either ranchers or miners or farmers, and oftentimes it's the best chunks of that land that are going to be pulled apart. So for the Native Americans, this is another swipe at taking away another chunk of their land after they've been pushed onto reservations. Let me see here. The next question. Yellow journalism, how is it used to anger Americans over Cuba? Yellow journalism is just tabloid journalism. So if you've ever seen inflammatory stories on social media that's meant to get you stirred up, and some of those stories may be real, some might be exaggerated, some might be lies. They're all trying to be like clickbait to get you to go someplace. That's what yellow journalism is. It's trying to create stories that are so sensational that you will have to buy the newspaper, and you'll have to buy the one tomorrow to find out how the story ends. And so what they start doing is they start doing this with both local stories. So, like, crime news becomes huge during the late 1800s. Scandalous news becomes huge. And stories about foreign powers abusing people who want independence becomes big news. And so that's what you have with newspaper publishers, is they're ginning up stories about how bad the Spanish are. And especially when the USS Maine blows up and nobody can explain how that happened, that's going to stoke the people of the United States to get into a war frenzy, and that's going to lead us into the Spanish-American War. Let me see here. Next question has to do with, can I explain the role of Europeans during 27, how they were connected to Latin American countries? I think I covered that pretty well just a second ago, dealing with the fact that they're trying to swoop into the Spanish colonies that now find themselves independent. But if you've got another question connected to that, feel free to post so I can help you out with that. Yellow journalism is the same as the yellow press, so hopefully, Olivia, that's something I've already taken care of. The Boxer Rebellion, pretty straightforward and simple. In China, during the open door policy, the leaders of China were not happy about Americans moving in, and there was a nationalistic movement of people inside of China who were trying to figure out ways to hold on to Chinese independence and drive out Westerners who they saw as being foreigners, who were taking advantage of China while it was weak. And these people were practicing martial arts. They were planning on attacking the people who were engaging in the open door policy. They would attack like missionaries and embassies and other sorts of places. And it took a massive military backlash from the Europeans and the Americans combined to drive back the people involved in the Boxer Rebellion who were trying to hold on to Chinese independence. But eventually they got squashed, and the United States and Europeans were able to then establish their dominance over trade from that point forward. The next question I see here is about the 4-Acre Act. 4-Acre Act is really straightforward and simple. It's just the thing that officially makes Puerto Rico a possession of the United States that eventually leads it to becoming a territory of the United States. The next question has to do with Cervera's fleet. Was it sent to protect only Cuba or all of the Spanish possessions in the Caribbean? They were hoping that it could do something to drive back the American offensive. The problem is they got bottled up in the harbor in Havana, and then the biggest issue they're going to run into is they're outgunned by American ships that are much more technologically advanced. After they've refurbished following the Civil War. And so while there's an intent to try to protect all of the Spanish possessions, the Spanish are going to find themselves woefully underprepared for any of the attacks, whether it's in the Caribbean or in the Philippines. Let me see here. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty is going to be dealing with the establishment of a treaty. Let me see. This is going to be the treaty that is going to establish a route through Panama that will create a Panama Canal. Let me see here. What are the Grangers? The Grangers are one of 3 different farmer movements they described in Chapter 27. The Grangers were those local individuals founded by Oliver Kelly up in Anoka, Minnesota, where they were clubs to teach about like scientific farming techniques, and they eventually started creating political movements and laws like the Granger laws, especially that were meant to try to create co-ops, so that people would buy seed collectively. They would get together and they would pool their resources, so they could bargain for better prices from the seed manufacturers and the railroads. And then they also started getting into like the Granger laws, like Munn versus Illinois, that started regulating railroads until the Wabash cases threw that out. And so that was the federal government's job. The Grangers were then followed by the alliances that we learned about, the Southern alliances, the Midwestern alliances, where you have whole states of people who are farming, who are merging together into political forces. And then finally, the third farmer group that we really want to notice is your populist movement. That's going to be a nationwide political movement to try to push for farmers' rights. Let me see here. Next question, why did Grover Cleveland reject annexation of Hawaii? He was an anti-imperialist. He had multiple reasons for not being involved in wanting to take Hawaii over. He disagreed with the philosophy of Americans going out and conquering other countries. He thought that was what Europeans did, not Americans. He was nervous about what that would then lead to as like a domino effect about where we would end up. For Grover Cleveland, though, you know that he loses his presidency in 1897. He's replaced by William McKinley, and McKinley is very much an imperialist who will easily take over Hawaii for economic and military reasons. Let me see here. Next question, what was the Pullman strike? Pullman strike was one of a number of strikes that happened in the 1890s that demonstrated how desperate workers were getting, where inside the factory town that the Pullman pleasure car company was founded in, this is like a sleeping car that they add to trains that are built for luxury to help out rich people so they can travel in peace and comfort. The owner of that company cut everybody's wages by a third, but he left their rent exactly where it was. So he's driving these workers into bankruptcy when the economy has crashed. And so there's a strike that goes on that becomes a nationwide railroad strike, and it shuts down every train in the United States. And Grover Cleveland, instead of sympathizing with the workers, he's going to sympathize with the business owners, because if their railroads shut down, the economy is going to stay crashed. So what he did is he stuck a railroad car onto every one of the trains, and by stopping the trains with their strike, they were essentially violating federal law by preventing the delivery of the United States mail. You then had the train companies go into courts, and they were able to get injunctions where they were able to legally tell the strikers that they had to stop striking because they were impeding trade. So you're going to find that the first times that the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to be enforced is going to be during this time period against unions who are going to be seen as inhibiting the ability to trade inside the United States because of their collective efforts. And so the Pullman strike is one of a number of strikes, like the Homestead strike that happens in the late 1800s, that shows that there's rising tensions between the workers and the business owners. What significance did the Philippines have on America? It's a much bigger element to what influence did the Philippines have strategically on Americans' military policies outside the country, and that's going to be what we see as the bigger thing. They are going to provide an economic market both for raw materials coming to America and then Americans trading with the Philippines with finished products. But very much we're going to see the Philippines as being important, especially when it comes to foreign trade, the open door policy. They're going to become a huge element in World War II. And so we'll see that the Philippines are going to provide a jumping off point militarily, especially when America wants to do things like send its Great White Fleet on a demonstration voyage around the planet sent by Teddy Roosevelt. It's going to be one of those coaling stations that allows our ships to be able to reach any place in a short amount of time. Let me see here. Do we need to know anything about the Russo-Japanese War? Not a massive amount. The Russo-Japanese War is just a conflict that happens during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, where Japan and Russia are battling over Korea and Manchuria, and each of those two countries wants to dominate those areas imperialistically, especially since they had previously been protected by China, but China was now so weak that they couldn't protect those areas. In this war, Russia thought that it'd defeat Japan because they believed they had racial advantages over the Japanese. And then what will happen during the war is Japan has industrialized while Russia has not done so nearly as much. And Russia starts getting clobbered. And so in the Russo-Japanese War, both sides are willing to let Teddy Roosevelt step in and stop the war with a treaty process, because Japan wants to move on to becoming imperialistic in other places. They've already pretty much won. They just want to get the war done. And Russia wants to pull back because they want to save face, but they can't stand up to the Japanese military. And so for us, what we want to be noticing is this is America wading into being a mediator for other conflicts. But then what Teddy Roosevelt does at the end of the Portsmouth Treaty is he's going to have the Great White Fleet go steaming by the coastline for everybody to admire. And he essentially sends a message to both the Russians and the Japanese that we have a big stick that we can use against them if they started getting aggressive in the Pacific in ways that we don't like. So you very much have a squaring off between those three countries that demonstrates that there are rising tensions that we didn't have in the previous chapters when America was just focused on manifest destiny. Who are the Rough Riders? The Rough Riders are a volunteer regiment of cowboys and Ivy Leaguers put together by Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had a sad situation when he was younger as a politician in New York, where on the same day that his daughter was born, his wife died during childbirth, and then his mother died downstairs just a few moments later. And so the death of these two important women in his life kind of hurt Teddy Roosevelt a ton. So he gave his daughter to his sisters to raise for a while, and then he moved out west to become a cowboy in the western part of South Dakota, in Montana, and Wyoming. He kind of roamed around out there being a cowboy. And so he made a lot of friends there after making a lot of friends out east in the Ivy League. And so when the Spanish-American War comes, he puts together his friends from the East Coast Ivy League schools and his cowboy friends, and then they go off to San Antonio, Texas to train, and then they get on a boat and go down to Cuba with the ambition of engaging in great adventures, because for many Americans in the late 1800s, they believed the cities were robbing their manhood because they were out of touch with the wilderness. Teddy Roosevelt decided to do something manly, and he felt that shooting Spaniards in Cuba would be able to do that for him. So the Rough Riders is going to become a famous group, and it's going to help elevate Teddy Roosevelt to national prominence, because he's going to come back with all these stories about heroic greatness, and that's going to catapult him into becoming a national figure. He's too much of a reformer, though, for the Republicans to like him, and so that's why they choose him to be the vice president for McKinley's second term in 1900, assuming that they could make him disappear for 4 years, and instead McKinley gets shot dead, and we end up with a reformer New Yorker president who brings in the progressive era as a result. Let me see here. The Teller Amendment, I think we were good with the Teller Amendment, but let me just remind you again that the Teller Amendment is going to be created before the Spanish-American War, and what it's going to tell the Cuban people and the American people is that America does not want to dominate Cuba as a territory that we're going to have as part of our empire. We're just fighting for Cuban independence. Remember, that gets modified afterwards with the Platt Amendment, where America comes back and says, while you are independent, you are independent within the good graces of the United States. So if you start doing things the United States doesn't like, we reserve the right to be able to step in. And then they also create the Guantanamo Bay military base. So we do have military people who are on site in case the Cubans become too independent. So we're going to find that that's a limited independence they end up with. Who is Uncle Sam? Uncle Sam is a mascot for the United States that is going to be popularized during this time period. The old legends of this is that he was a person who was selling meat to the United States military, and that name connected to the packaging on that led him to become a mascot or a nickname for the fictional head of the United States. As far as the reality of where it comes from, that's less important than the fact that he'll become the symbol patriotically for Americans, especially in times of war, as a symbol of what the United States is about. Can I explain the Venezuelan border dispute? Sure, you're going to have issues going on between the United States and Britain, dealing with the issue of what those boundaries should be. And it almost brought America and Britain to the point of war until they were able to resolve the tensions going on between them. And they discussed for you the Great Rapprochement, where you're going to find more and more Britain is going to come to the realization that instead of looking at America as an enemy, they should be looking at America as friend, both because of their common cultural background, And also both of them have concerns about like rising power of Germany, of communism and socialism and anarchism. There's a lot of things that starts bringing them together to the point where they're going to have less and less of the conflicts like you read about there. Avital, do I know if school will be canceled tomorrow? I know that inside this district, there is a huge concern that has been going on ever since I started teaching here, and even when I went to school here way back when, decades ago, where many people in our district do not want to be the first ones to jump out in front of everybody else and close school, because if they do it too early and it turns out that it wasn't needed, that can be quite embarrassing. I remember when it was first years that I was teaching, they canceled school for a gigantic snowfall, and then the weather got up to like 40 degrees, and the snow all melted by about 10 o'clock. So we were driving around and having a great time when there was no snow on the ground. So I would bet if the snow continues, they would have an answer sometime around like 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. If I had to bet on it, though, your snow is happening at the wrong time, and so I am betting that I will see you tomorrow, and that makes me very excited and happy because after a 3-day weekend, I miss all of you. I do not see any other questions, and so I hope your day off went well. I hope your studying is also going well, but also keep in mind, like I said, the first 2 periods I've got nothing going on. So if you have any sort of questions or problems that pop up for the rest of the night and you want to email, feel free to do so. Good luck with the rest of your studying. Have a great night. Drive safe tomorrow if you're a driver, and I'll see you then.